Madeline Cooper was full of hope when she left Toronto to marry Derek Winters, a quiet handyman from rural Washington. Just 74 days later, she vanished without a trace. No goodbye, no witnesses, no body. What began as a long-distance romance turned into a chilling mystery that would grip two countries and expose the dark secrets hidden behind a wedding ring. Madeline Cooper had always lived a quiet life. At 29 years old, she'd never been one to seek the spotlight. She enjoyed simple things: mornings with coffee and a book, walks near the ocean, visits with her tight-knit family in Victoria, British Columbia. Her days as a dental assistant were steady and uneventful, and for the most part, she was content. But deep down, Madeline longed for something more. She wanted a family, a home of her own, and a love that felt secure. When she met Derek Winters online, it felt like something had finally shifted in her favor. Their first messages were polite, almost formal. Derek, 6 years older, lived in Idaho and described himself as a conservative man with traditional values. He'd served in the U.S. Marine Corps before settling in Carter Valley, a remote rural area outside Boise. He now ran his own small construction business and lived in a farmhouse that had been in his family for generations. To Madeline, it sounded like a peaceful life. Derek praised her faith, her modesty, her commitment to family, qualities he said he struggled to find in American women. It didn't take long before their messages turned into phone calls, and phone calls into video chats that stretched late into the night. Their connection grew quickly. Madeline's friends were surprised by how fast everything moved, but she insisted it felt right. Derek was stable, mature, and ready to settle down. He told her he'd been praying for someone like her to come into his life. Within 5 months, he proposed. Not with a ring, but with a promise that he would take care of her, love her, and give her the home and family she'd always dreamed of. He wanted her to move to Idaho as soon as possible, get married, and start their life together. The decision didn't come without doubts. Madeline's parents were worried about her moving to another country for someone she barely knew in person. She had only met Derek face-to-face once during a long weekend he spent in Victoria. He seemed polite, quiet, maybe a little rigid, but there was nothing overtly wrong. He rarely smiled, but he treated Madeline respectfully and even brought flowers for her mother. He said all the right things. In the end, her parents gave their reluctant blessing. Madeline was determined. She believed in love, in fate, and in the future she'd built in her head. She quit her job, sold her car, and packed 2 suitcases. She canceled her lease and said goodbye to her co-workers, assuring everyone this wasn't a rash decision. It was a fresh start. On a gray Monday morning in March, she boarded a one-way flight from Vancouver to Boise, her heart full of nervous excitement. Derek picked her up at the airport in a dusty pickup truck and barely said a word during the hour-long drive to his property. He didn't hold her hand. He didn't ask about her flight. Still, Madeline chalked it up to nerves. He wasn't the affectionate type, she reminded herself. He was a man of action, not words. The farmhouse was older than she expected. 2 stories, chipped paint, and a wide yard full of rusted tools and broken furniture. It sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by thick trees and empty fields. There were no neighbors in sight. The nearest store was a 20-minute drive. It wasn't exactly what she'd envisioned, but she convinced herself it could be charming once cleaned up. She told herself it just needed a woman's touch. They were married 3 days later at the county courthouse. No wedding dress, no flowers, no celebration. Just Madeline in a blue skirt, Derek in a wrinkled button-down shirt, and two strangers as witnesses. His mother showed up late and left early. There were no pictures. Derek didn't kiss her in public. Afterward, they drove back to the farmhouse, where Derek said he needed to catch up on work emails and disappeared into his office for the rest of the day. Still, Madeline remained hopeful. She cleaned the kitchen, unpacked her clothes, and made dinner. She set the table for two and waited until nearly 10 p.m. before Derek finally emerged. He said nothing about the wedding, just ate, watched TV in silence, and went to bed. Over the following weeks, life settled into a quiet, uncomfortable routine. Derek worked long hours, often leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. He was rarely affectionate and didn't seem interested in conversation. Madeline stayed home, tending to the house, cooking meals, and trying to adjust to her new surroundings. But the isolation began to wear on her. With no car of her own, she couldn't leave the property without Derek. There was no internet in the house, and cell service was spotty at best. She wrote letters to her sister and tried to sound cheerful, but small details slipped through. How lonely it was, how quiet Derek had become, how she hadn't made any friends yet. She brushed off the unease, telling herself it was just the adjustment period. After all, moving countries and starting a new life wasn't supposed to be easy. She had committed to this marriage. She had promised to make it work. But by the time April turned to May, something in Madeline's letters changed. She sounded more hesitant, her words more careful. She began to mention that Derek was controlling. He didn't like when she left the house alone, didn't want her talking to strangers in town, and seemed angry when she asked too many questions. The phone calls with her family became shorter and less frequent. She often ended them abruptly, saying she was tired or that Derek was waiting. Still, no one expected what would come next. Madeline had left everything behind for a new beginning. But the life she thought she was walking into was nothing like the one that awaited her. The story she believed was unfolding into a fairy tale was, in reality, the first chapter of a chilling nightmare. At first, no one noticed that Madeline Cooper had vanished. It had only been a few days since her last phone call home, and she often went stretches of time without contacting friends or family. Her sister Rachel figured Madeline was just settling into married life, maybe busy with home projects or trying to adjust to the slower pace of rural Idaho. But as more days passed, with no updates, the silence began to feel strange. Rachel sent a few texts, then emails, none of which were returned. When she tried to call, the line went straight to voicemail. That was when concern started to grow. In Victoria, Rachel began reaching out to others, friends, old co-workers of Madeline, even her former landlord. No one had heard from her. The last post on her social media was from nearly 3 weeks earlier, a photo of a homemade apple pie with the caption, "Learning new recipes in my new home. One step at a time." There had been no posts since. Finally, Rachel made a call to the Canyon County Sheriff's Office in Idaho. She explained that her sister had recently moved to the area after marrying an American man named Derek Winters. She hadn't heard from her in almost 2 weeks, and she was worried something had happened. Deputies made a wellness check that same day. The property was remote, an old farmhouse tucked behind a line of trees with no visible neighbors nearby. When they arrived, Derek answered the door calmly. He seemed surprised to see them, but cooperative. He explained that Madeline had left the house about a week earlier, after an argument. According to him, she had packed a small bag and said she needed space. He claimed she'd taken a bus to Spokane, Washington, to to stay with a friend. When asked for the friend's name, Derek said he didn't know it. When asked why he hadn't reported his wife missing, he shrugged and said she'd left on her own. Something about the situation didn't sit right with the deputies. They asked to look around the house. Derek allowed them in, though he lingered closely behind them the entire time. The home was sparsely decorated. Madeline's clothes were still in the closet, her shoes lined neatly by the back door. Her passport was found in the kitchen drawer, along with a Canadian driver's license and immigration paperwork. Her phone charger was still plugged into the wall. A mug of cold tea sat on the windowsill beside an open notebook filled with neat, slanted handwriting. It didn't look like someone had planned to leave and never return. Outside the house, the property was quiet. A large red barn sat at the back, its doors padlocked. The grass was overgrown, and a few old tires leaned against the fence. Nothing appeared out of place. Still, the deputies filed a missing persons report that night. It was, after all, unusual for someone to disappear without taking any form of identification, money, or phone, especially someone who had just uprooted their entire life to be in a new country. Back in Karcher Valley, word started to spread. It didn't take long for neighbors and townspeople to start talking. Though Derek had lived in the area for years, he wasn't exactly well liked. He kept to himself, rarely attended local events, and was known for having a short temper. A cashier at the town's only grocery store remembered seeing Madeline every Tuesday afternoon. She was polite, quiet, and usually came in alone. About 2 weeks earlier, she had come in with a bruise on her upper arm. The cashier hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now she couldn't stop thinking about it. Another neighbor, an elderly man who lived half a mile down the road, recalled hearing raised voices one night. He couldn't make out what was being said, but the shouting had gone on for nearly 20 minutes, followed by a loud banging sound, and then total silence. That had been 12 days ago. No one had seen Madeline since. As deputies started to gather more statements from locals, they discovered something else. Derek had been married once before, almost a decade ago. The marriage lasted less than a year. That ex-wife had left town, suddenly, telling people she was getting away for good. She never filed any police reports, but neighbors remembered that she had looked tired and scared in the final weeks before she left. Investigators tried contacting the friend Derek had mentioned in Spokane, but no one seemed to know who she was. There was no bus ticket under Madeline's name, no credit card transactions, no phone activity. She had simply vanished. By the end of the week, the sheriff's department escalated the case. A search team was formed to comb the area surrounding the farmhouse. Dogs were brought in. Volunteers walked through nearby fields, woods, and creeks. Nothing turned up. Madeline's face was now on flyers posted at gas stations and town centers. News outlets started picking up the story, describing a Canadian woman who had disappeared just 74 days after her wedding. Her parents pleaded publicly for help, urging anyone with information to come forward. The peaceful image of a newlywed woman settling into country life had shattered. In its place, there was growing suspicion, fear, and a gnawing question that no one could answer. What had happened to Madeline Cooper? And why did it seem like the man who was supposed to protect her was the only one who didn't seem worried? She was gone. By the third week of Madeline Cooper's disappearance, the tone of the investigation had shifted. What had begun as a search for a possibly missing woman was quickly becoming something darker, more unsettling. Though no evidence had been found to confirm foul play, Detectives were no longer treating the case as a routine missing person report. There were simply too many unanswered questions and too many inconsistencies in Derek Winters's story. Detectives returned to the farmhouse with a search warrant. This time, they brought forensic specialists, cadaver dogs, and evidence technicians. Every room in the house was combed carefully. Floors were checked for signs of recent cleaning. Furniture was moved. Walls were scanned for blood traces using luminol. The basement, dark and musty, was examined inch by inch. The dogs showed interest near the fireplace and an area of disturbed soil outside near the tree line, but no human remains were found. Inside the house, the forensic team made a discovery that raised more red flags. Hidden in a locked drawer of Derek's office desk were several printed pages of Madeline's private emails and journal entries. Investigators later confirmed these had been accessed without her knowledge. They painted a portrait of a woman who had been increasingly fearful, confused and isolated. In one journal entry, dated just 2 weeks before she disappeared, she wrote that she felt like a guest in her own life, and worried that she had made a mistake marrying someone she barely knew. She described Derek's coldness, his growing mood swings, and how he had started keeping the car keys hidden and locking the barn at night. The more investigators uncovered, the more ominous the story became. Derek had lied about several details. He told police Madeline had no local friends, yet they discovered she had struck up a short but close friendship with a woman named Dana who worked at the town library. Dana told police Madeline had confided in her just once, briefly, nervously. She said she didn't feel safe and was considering leaving. Dana had urged her to call her family and look into Canadian consulate support. But after that conversation, Madeline never returned to the library. Cell tower records showed that Madeline's phone had stopped transmitting signals on April 12th. Around the same time, her communications with her family had abruptly ended. GPS data revealed her last known location, the Winters property. After that, there was nothing. No outgoing pings, no travel history, no activity at all. It was as though her phone had been physically destroyed or turned off forever. Investigators began to look more closely at Derek's movements. He had told police he'd been working on a roof installation job during the week of Madeline's disappearance. However, when detectives contacted the client listed on the invoice, they were told the project had been postponed and Derek had never shown up. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station placed him near a remote section of land off Route 9 2 days after Madeline was last seen. He had purchased gas, water, and a bag of cement. He had no explanation for this trip. Authorities requested a full ground search of the area off Route 9. Drones scanned the woods, while search teams combed through brush and creek beds. Deep in the forest, officers discovered a large patch of disturbed earth. Though no body was found, the soil showed signs of recent digging and fill. A forensic team was brought in to examine the site. Ground-penetrating radar revealed an unusual cavity below the surface, but rain in the days following had compromised the evidence. Samples were collected and sent to the lab, but results were inconclusive. Meanwhile, media attention around the case had exploded. Headlines across Canada and the U.S. called Madeline's story a cross-border mystery, a marriage-turned-nightmare, and the bride who vanished. News crews camped outside the sheriff's office. Derek refused to speak to reporters. In fact, he stopped speaking to police altogether and hired a lawyer. Without a body and without definitive evidence of a crime, there was no arrest. He remained a free man, living alone on the same property where his wife had last been seen. The pressure on the investigation was mounting. Public frustration grew. Online forums speculated about what really happened at the farmhouse. Some believed Madeline had escaped and was hiding. Others were convinced Derek had killed her and disposed of the body so well it would never be found. Her family, devastated and desperate, offered a $50,000 reward for any information that led to a break in the case. Then came the first significant lead in weeks. A hiker reported finding a piece of torn fabric deep in the woods about 10 miles from the Winters property. It was faded and caught on a tree branch. The hiker turned it in after recognizing Madeline's face from a news broadcast. Lab results later confirmed the fabric matched a dress Madeline had been photographed wearing in her last social media post. Search efforts shifted to that area. Police scoured the region using thermal imaging and excavation tools. They found nothing conclusive, no remains, no direct evidence. But it confirmed one thing. Madeline had not taken a bus to Spokane. She had not run away. She had, at some point, left that house and entered the woods. Whether she walked, was carried, or was forced remained unknown. In a case full of shadows and silences, this scrap of fabric was a rare piece of light. It didn't solve the mystery. It didn't bring Madeline home. But it pushed the investigation forward and reminded everyone watching that something terrible had happened, and someone wasn't telling the truth. Public interest in Madeline Cooper's disappearance had reached a boiling point by the 4th week. Her photo was everywhere, on news websites, television, social media, and pinned to bulletin boards in local shops. The story had taken on a haunting symbolism. A young woman leaves her home country for love and disappears less than 3 months later. People were invested not just because of the tragedy, but because of how suddenly it had happened. And with no body and no arrest, theories began to take on lives of their own. In Karcher Valley, tension ran thick. The Winters property was no longer just another old farmhouse hidden behind a line of trees. It had become a spectacle. Locals drove by, slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse of something. Police tape still hung loosely from one side of the barn, fluttering in the breeze. Derek Winters, who had mostly stayed out of public view since the investigation began, was now rarely seen at all. When he did leave the property, people noticed. He had become the center of whispers and pointed stares. Law enforcement had reached a frustrating standstill. Despite extensive searches, numerous interviews, and strong suspicions, they still had no physical evidence tying Derek to a crime. The case against him was circumstantial. The burned items in the fire pit had been too degraded to identify. The patch of disturbed soil in the woods had yielded no remains. The dress fragment found by the hiker hinted at foul play but could not prove it, and Derek's refusal to speak, while suspicious, was his legal right. Behind the scenes, the sheriff's department was working closely with forensic psychologists and FBI profilers. They began building a psychological profile of Derek, looking for patterns in his behavior, clues in his past. They examined his previous marriage again, speaking with the ex-wife who had left the area years ago. She agreed to talk under the condition of anonymity. Her account was chilling. She described Derek as charming at first, but increasingly controlling. He isolated her from friends and family, restricted her movements, and monitored her communications. Eventually, she fled one night with the help of a friend, leaving behind nearly all her belongings. She had always feared he would come after her. Now, hearing about Madeline, she said she regretted not reporting what had happened back then. This new testimony provided law enforcement with a clearer picture of Derek's behavior patterns. They requested access to more of his digital history, his Internet searches, message history, and location data. What they found raised further alarms. In the weeks before Madeleine's disappearance, Derek had visited websites discussing how to delete phone data remotely, how to erase GPS logs, and even how to hide a body in heavily wooded areas. He had searched for chemical decomposition rates and how long to wait before someone is declared missing. Again, none of this was enough to arrest him, but it painted a damning portrait. For Madeleine's family, each passing day felt like a new form of grief. Her mother stopped answering media calls. Her father issued a single, trembling statement on national television, and her sister Rachel took over communication with police. Rachel was tireless. She printed new flyers, coordinated with advocacy groups for missing persons, and pushed for the Canadian Embassy to become more involved. She appeared on morning shows and podcasts, always delivering the same message. Madeleine would never have left without telling someone. She would never have walked into the woods and disappeared on her own. Meanwhile, a new development quietly took shape. A wildlife camera, mounted by a local conservation group about 5 miles east of the Winters property, had captured images on the night of April 12th. Among shots of deer and raccoons, there was one blurry photo of a man dragging what appeared to be a tarp across a trail just after midnight. The image was grainy, the figure partially obscured by trees, but the timing was significant. Investigators enhanced the image as much as possible. They couldn't identify the face, but they could identify the vehicle parked in the background. An older model pickup truck. It matched the one Derek owned. With that information, police obtained a second warrant, this time to search the truck. The vehicle had been recently detailed, but not thoroughly enough. Trace amounts of blood were found under the lining of the bed. DNA analysis confirmed it belonged to Madeleine. That was the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for, though there was still no body. The discovery of Madeleine's blood in Derek's truck, combined with the forensic digital trail, the inconsistent alibi, and the witness accounts, was enough to move forward. Derek was arrested on suspicion of second-degree murder. The charges were filed even though a body had not been recovered, a rare but not unheard-of move in homicide cases. Prosecutors argued that the totality of evidence made it clear that Madeleine had died and that Derek was responsible. News of the arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Some felt relief. Others were stunned that it had taken so long. Derek's lawyer issued a short statement maintaining his client's innocence, claiming that the evidence was circumstantial and that Derek had never harmed his wife. But public opinion had already turned against him. The court of public perception had delivered its own verdict weeks ago. With Derek behind bars awaiting trial, the question shifted. The focus was no longer on what might have happened. It was now about where Madeleine was. Investigators believed she had been killed shortly after April 12th, but the exact timeline remained unclear. Without her body, there would be challenges in proving the details in court. Yet for the first time, there was momentum. The case had moved beyond whispers and speculation into hard legal consequence. Still, one truth remained unchanged. Madeleine was gone. And somewhere out there, her body was waiting to be found. As the trial date approached, the case of Madeleine Cooper gripped both Canada and the United States. Her face had become a symbol of tragic vulnerability. A young woman who left everything behind for love and disappeared without a trace. Now, with Derek Winters charged with her murder, the world waited for justice. But even with a suspect in custody, the deepest questions remained unanswered. Where was Madeleine? And what exactly had happened in the final hours of her life? In the weeks following Derek's arrest, law enforcement intensified their efforts to find her body. They returned to the dense forests east of Karcher Valley and launched another ground search based on new analysis of Derek's GPS records. This time they brought cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains buried deep in the soil. Despite their determination, nothing was found. The woods remained silent, unwilling to give up their secrets. Without a body, prosecutors prepared for a difficult trial. Cases without physical remains are rare and challenging. The evidence had to be overwhelming, clear enough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that a murder had occurred. Prosecutors leaned heavily on the blood found in Derek's truck, his incriminating internet searches, and the disturbing photo captured by the wildlife camera. They had testimony from Madeleine's friends and family, who described a woman growing increasingly afraid. They had digital records that contradicted Derek's alibi. They had motive, opportunity, and a pattern of control and isolation. The defense, meanwhile, argued that the case was built on assumptions. They claimed the blood in the truck could have come from an accident, a cut perhaps, or a nosebleed. They questioned the clarity of the wildlife camera footage and suggested that the man in the image could have been someone else. They pointed out the lack of a murder weapon, the absence of a body, and the fact that no eyewitnesses had seen Derek commit a crime. Without direct evidence of death, they insisted, no one could say for certain what had happened to Madeleine Cooper. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Inside the courtroom, Rachel Cooper sat in the front row every day. She listened to every detail, no matter how painful. She watched as her sister's final days were dissected, analyzed, and reconstructed. She heard Madeleine's journal entries, read aloud, saw the photos of the search sites, and witnessed the defense attempt to sow doubt. But she never wavered in her belief that Derek was responsible. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. The verdict was read, guilty of second-degree murder. Derek Winters showed no visible emotion. He simply stared ahead, unmoving, as the judge ordered him remanded into custody pending sentencing. For Madeleine's family, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice, in part, had been served, but closure was still elusive. Without knowing where Madeleine was, there could be no true peace. In the months that followed the trial, public interest in the case slowly began to fade. News stories took over the headlines, but for those closest to Madeleine, the impact never faded. Rachel continued searching for answers. She launched a foundation in her sister's name, offering resources for women leaving abusive relationships and raising awareness about international marriages and the risks that sometimes accompany them. She also worked closely with law enforcement, reviewing any new tips that came in. Most were dead ends, but Rachel refused to stop. She believed that one day someone would find Madeleine. Then, nearly a year after Madeleine's disappearance, a breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A local farmer clearing a neglected section of his property stumbled upon something unusual in a shallow ravine. Half buried under fallen branches and earth was a piece of faded fabric, floral, delicate. Nearby, something else caught his eye. A section of bone, discolored and partly exposed. The sheriff's office was called immediately. A forensic team arrived within hours and began carefully excavating the site. Over the next 2 days, human remains were recovered, along with fragments of clothing and a necklace that Rachel later confirmed had belonged to Madeleine. Dental records provided conclusive identification. Madeleine Cooper had finally been found. News brought a quiet sadness over the town. Though many had long assumed she was dead, confirmation carried a different weight. Her family held a small memorial service at the edge of the woods where her body was discovered. It was private, peaceful, and filled with photographs and letters from those who had loved her. The discovery also led to a second sentencing hearing. With the recovery of Madeline's remains, the prosecution was able to build a clearer timeline of her death. Additional forensic analysis showed signs of blunt force trauma. At the hearing, the judge imposed the maximum sentence allowed under the law, life in prison without the possibility of parole. This time, Derek said nothing. He only glanced once toward Rachel, who held her sister's locket in her hands and never looked away. Madeline's story became a cautionary tale shared in advocacy groups and community workshops. Her foundation expanded, offering legal and emotional support for women in cross-border marriages and situations of isolation. Her legacy became one of awareness, strength, and resilience.